Okay, so hello everyone, I'm Connor and welcome back to my design class. I hope everyone is doing okay. Welcome to this video, this live stream, which is going to be all about mistakes that I've made in the past in my 10 years of learning Adobe Photoshop and what I do differently if I was starting out today. So we're going to be covering a whole load of things. Unfortunately, I can't cover everything and all of the mistakes that I've made, and it's going to be quite painful for me going over all of these mistakes again. But I will be covering most of the basic ones and hopefully some things that I haven't actually covered on the channel before. So hopefully you'll be able to learn something new today that you can then bring forward into your practice in Adobe Photoshop from next week onwards. So do let me know in the chat if you have any questions or things that you have been, how long have you been using Adobe Photoshop? It'd be very interesting to know. Maybe what are some of the things that you made, the mistakes that you made, and some of the things that you would change if you were starting out today. Because I'm aware that all of us are very good at Adobe Photoshop, and it's always great to hear what you guys have been struggling on and how you've been able to work around it and what you've learned in the process of doing all of that. So we're going to be starting today by covering a few of the topics, a few of the things that I particularly found useful when I started learning them and started implementing them in my daily Photoshop practice. So we're going to be starting off with a simple one, which is smart objects. And unfortunately, it's one of those ones that if you're unfamiliar with what smart objects are, it can be quite hard to actually understand how they work and how you can properly integrate them into your Photoshop practice. So the easiest way to think of a smart object is essentially having a Photoshop document within a Photoshop document. It doesn't quite work like that in practice, but if you think of it like this, it's an easy way to conceptualize how you might be able to use it when you're actually designing in your document. So one of the great things about smart objects is they retain all of the rasterized data and ensure that when you manipulate your layer, for example, perhaps you want to add smart filters, or perhaps you want to resize your layers, smart objects actually retain all of that that original data, that original rasterized pixelated information, so that if you ever want to go back and undo the changes that you've made, you'll be able to actually recover the original file, the original rasterized data, without stretching it or over pixelating it. So for example, a good way to think about this might be when we create shapes in Adobe Photoshop. So anytime you're using things such as selections or for example, if you put a photo into Adobe Photoshop, you're always working with pixels. So for example, if I create a small circle using the marquee tool and then perhaps fill it in with a color, what you'll notice is, if I just get rid of that, if I deselect, this shape is now pixelated. Oop, I did it on the wrong layer. That's why. So if I create a new layer, then we're not on the background layer. So this shape is made up of pixels. So if I zoom in, you'll notice that the shape has individual pixels which make up a circle. And if we zoom out, it looks like a sharp circle because those pixels become smaller and smaller. One of the disadvantages of using rasterized layers, and especially when using shapes, is that if you try and transform it, so if I press Command and T or Control and T for Windows and try to free transform it and increase the size, we actually lose a lot of that quality of the circle. For example, you can see around the edges here that it's become very, very pixelated. And smart objects are a great way to combat this. They won't inherently increase the sharpness of your layer. However, they can retain the original sharpness that your layer had. So a case study where we might have this might be when we import a photo into Photoshop. Say you're trying to create a collage using your photo, and perhaps you want to manipulate this photo by perhaps making it smaller, so pressing Command and T, and perhaps you want it to fit into your design, you move it around, etc., and you confirm your choice. However, in the future, perhaps you decide that actually it isn't in the correct spot and you actually want to be able to place it, make it much larger again. So you try and Command T and you stretch it. And as you can see, every time that you repeat this process, perhaps you change your mind again, you're inherently losing a lot of the data within your image. And it becomes stretched and pixelated every time you try to free transform it. So the advantage of using a smart object is that none of this will happen if you try and transform your images, shapes, or whatever it might be. So if we go back to the shape example to start with, if I create a slightly larger shape, just using the marquee tool, let's create a circle because it's easier to see the pixels on a circle. So perhaps something like this. I'll create a new layer, press G and fill it in using this blue color. To create a smart object, it's very, very simple. You've just got to choose whichever layer you want to use. So in this case, I want to use this layer 1. I'm going to right click and then I'm going to go to convert to smart object. And what you'll notice is that the layer thumbnail actually changes. You'll have this small icon on it, which means that it is a smart object. Now, if I try and transform this shape, so for example, Command and T, and I reduce the size to quite small, like so. What we'd expect if it's a pixelated layer and try to increase it again, we'd actually lose a lot of that quality. But what you'll notice is that we actually retain that quality. And that is because Photoshop is saving that original data that we have and then going back to that original. So if I press Command and T again, you can actually see at the top here where we can determine the width and height of our smart object, that it's currently at 96% of its original size. So for example, if I wanted the original size that I had, I could just type in 100% and I'll get that original design back. Another benefit of smart objects is the ability to actually edit smart objects and being able to change those smart objects. So in order to edit a smart object, all you have to do is go to the layer thumbnail icon, double click on that, and you'll actually bring up that original shape that we've created in a new Photoshop document. However, this is a .psb document, so it's contained within this .psd. So this is where it gets slightly confusing. It's not actually a separate Photoshop document. It still is information within the original Photoshop document that we created. However, this is a type of Photoshop document, but it's not a standalone document unless you go ahead and file and save as a new document type. So what you could do is, now that you've opened up your smart object, you can actually make any changes within your smart object. So for example, if I add some text, so maybe I add my title here, I'll give it a color that stands out from the blue. And I try to scale that text, something like that. Let's say this is my logo. I can press save, so Command and S, or I can go to File and Save. This will now update the smart object so that if I go back to the document that we were editing, you'll see that that is now included within our smart object. And all of this information is still within one layer, and I can always go back and edit that smart object just by double clicking on it. The important thing is that if you do make any changes to your smart object, you do need to press save in order to make those changes apparent in your original document. You can always go ahead and close it and reopen it just by double clicking on that layer thumbnail. So the benefit of this is that if you have, for example, a complex transform on this, so for example, perhaps I use a warp and I try and warp all of this information into a shape that looks great for my design, perhaps not something like this, but for example, if I now double click on this and actually make a change within our smart object, for example, I change the circle to, let's say, this purple pinky color that I have and press save. If I now go back, that will also automatically update within our smart object with all of those transform properties still applied, which is great for when you want to make changes, or perhaps you have, for example, if you're using a mockup, in a lot of mockups, you'll have, if it's a phone, you'll have the screen, which is a smart object. You can double click on that, change any of the contents within the screen, press save, and it will automatically update within your mockup itself. So this is a great way to be able to actually save information in a separate space while still having the ability to manipulate it and go back and restore it to 100% or undo any of those changes that you made to the smart object. Another benefit of smart objects is that you can actually go back and change smart filters on them. So for example, if I go to that photo that we had earlier, if I change this to a smart object, so right clicking on the layer and go to convert to smart object, I can now actually apply filters to this layer, and I can always go back and edit those filters. So in order to add a smart filter to this object, I can go filter, and then I can choose from any of the filters that I have here. So for example, a common one might be to add Gaussian blur. And it just came up on my other window. There we are. So I can now actually adjust the amount of Gaussian blur that I want to apply to this image and press OK. If this was a standard layer, I wouldn't actually be able to go back and make any edits after this. However, because it's a smart object, it actually comes up as a smart filter on the right-hand side under our layers panel here. So I can actually go back and double click on the Gaussian blur and actually change the blur at a later date if I'm unhappy with what I've applied. And the same applies for any of the things in filter. So it also applies for things such as camera raw filter, liquify, etc. You can actually go back and make changes to it later, which is very beneficial for when you're editing your photos or any other layer in Photoshop, because it means it's a non-destructive process. A destructive process would be, for example, using a rasterized layer, making a lot of changes and then not being able to go back and actually edit the original document. However, because this is a non-destructive process, I can actually go back and edit the blur, for example, because it's a smart object. So that's essentially the basics of how to use smart objects in Adobe Photoshop. And it's something that will just save you a lot of time, and it will ensure that you can actually go back and make changes to your designs in case you ever do make any mistakes that you didn't mean to make. So I'm just going to close this document. And the next thing that I wanted to talk about was Photoshop Actions, which is a really exciting tool in Photoshop, which allows you to basically automate processes or parts of your design process within Photoshop, so that Photoshop automatically does all of those tasks for you and you don't actually have to implement all of them yourself. So the way I wanted to demonstrate this is a good example would be the thumbnails that I make for this video. So for my thumbnails, I have a set design that I like to use, something that's consistent across my channel. And I like to use Photoshop Actions in certain cases in order to actually get my templates ready, or to repeat certain processes that I know I have to do over and over again on a consistent basis. So for example, within my thumbnails, I always have this banner at the bottom, which indicates which software I'm going to be teaching in this live stream. So in this case, this is a thumbnail for my other channel, which is my film class, in which we're doing Premiere Pro later today. So as you can see, I have to be able to manipulate this banner also depending on what software I'm going to be teaching, and I want to be able to edit all of those things directly. Well, the benefit of using Photoshop Actions is that, of course, Photoshop can do all of this for you. So if I go to Tutorial, in order to find Photoshop Actions, what we can do is go to Window and then go to Actions. And do let me know if you've ever used this before and if this is something that you like to use. I find it very, very useful for certain processes, but it can also be tedious depending on what you're going to be using it for. So as you can see, I have a folder here, and within it, I have the banner action that I like to use. If I press play, Photoshop is actually going to undertake a lot of those tasks for me. I can add the custom title that I want to use for this tutorial. I can press tick. And as you can see, Photoshop has just automatically created all of those assets for me because I've created a Photoshop action in order to do that. So breaking down what an action actually is. So if I undo all of these steps that Photoshop took. Photoshop actions essentially consist of a load of tasks within an action, which you can play, record, delete, or stop at any time. And you can also group them into folders in order to be able to manage them properly. So as you can see, I've created a banner action here. And in this action, I have a whole load of tasks that Photoshop completes for me. And this actually creates my YouTube banner for me. So as you can see, it undertakes all of these tasks. And then at the end, I should have that complete banner. So what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be showing you how to create this from scratch. So the best thing to start with is always to stay nice and organized. So I'm actually going to delete this action so we can do this again. So I'm going to press on the new folder icon here. And as you can see, I can now name the new folder that I want to use. So I'm going to call it thumbnail because I know I want to create an action to create my Photoshop thumbnails, my YouTube thumbnails. So next I need to create a new action, and I can just do that by clicking on this button here. And I can name my action. So I know I want to create the banner for all of my thumbnails. So I'm just going to press like this. It's automatically going to start recording. So this is something to be aware of, because any changes or anything you do within Photoshop is going to be recorded under this action. So I always like to turn it off just before I know what I'm actually going to be doing. So like we said, we're going to be trying to get Photoshop to create my standard thumbnail layout. So the channel banner, the banner at the bottom, and all of the guides using actions. So to start recording my action, all I have to do is press on the record button here. And as you'll see, that will go red, and I can now, anything that I do in Adobe Photoshop is automatically going to be recorded by this action. So the first thing I like to do is I always like to have some guides. So I'm going to add some guides to my scene. And as you'll notice in the actions panel, every time I create a new guide, it's automatically adding a task within our action. And this is to create a new guide. And it's actually keeping all of that information as to where we want to store that guide. So next time, it's automatically going to create that guide for us. Now I know that the height of my banner is always at a certain height. I know it's always 889 pixels from the top of my screen, my canvas even. So I'm just going to go and find that by zooming in. Unfortunately, this is, if you guys know a much more precise way of quickly adding a guide to a set height than zooming in, do let me know. So as you can see, I've zoomed in 889 pixels on the y-axis, and I know that that is roughly the space that I want my banner to be in. So next, as you can see, we've created all of our guides. So now at the moment, if I press stop recording and I actually press play, Photoshop is automatically going to create those guides for us every time we press play on this action. But I actually want to create a banner here. So what we're going to do is we're going to fill in that space. So you could either use shapes if you know you want to change it in the future. I know this is going to be set, so I'm happy to just use the marquee tool for this purpose. So I'm going to create a selection using the rectangular marquee tool. And then I'm also going to create a new layer. And to stay organized, I'm also just going to fill that, give that a name. So I might give that banner color or banner background or whatever you might want to call it. Next, I know that I want to actually fill in that space. So I'm going to go to the paint bucket tool, and I'm just going to press there once in order to fill that selection in. I can press Command and D in order to deselect. And next, I know I want to add my title. So I'm going to go to the type tool on the left-hand toolbar, and I'm going to press once in the center. It's not going to be perfectly aligned. I will have to do that in a minute. And for the moment, I'm just going to leave it as lorem ipsum. I am going to make a few changes to the characters. So I know that my text is always 155 pixels in size. Leading doesn't really matter in this case. I do have a tracking set there. There we go. And I can just press on the tick here now. If I go back to the selection tool, I also know that I like to have that centered. So I'm just going to center it roughly in the bottom of my banner like so. I might move it one up like that. And as you can see, I've roughly got the layout of my thumbnail at the moment. The text is something that I might want to be able to change specifically for the thumbnail that I'm creating, whether I'm going to be teaching Premiere Pro or I'm going to be teaching After Effects. So this is something that I might want to be able to change every time that I actually use this thumbnail. But first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to just press stop on recording the action. So Photoshop is no longer going to record anything that we do in it at the moment. So what we can do next is if I quickly undo everything that we've created, hopefully, if this is work, I'm even going to undo this. So I'm going to go right to the beginning of the document. If this works, and I go to the action panel and I go to our action and I press play, hopefully it should create everything that we just did. And as you can see, the benefit is that all of these layers are individual layers, and I can actually edit all of these layers individually. Now, of course, sometimes you might want the process. This is, by the way, it's a great way of demonstrating how you create certain things for clients or even for colleagues. If you want to be able to demonstrate to your colleague how you go about creating all of these things, you could create an action and actually delay how quickly Photoshop actually undertakes your action. In order to do that, what you can do is you can go to these 3 lines at the top, and you can actually change the playback options. So for example, at the moment it's accelerated because we want the action to be performed as quickly as possible. But if, for example, you used actions to show to your new colleagues how you actually went about creating a new design or something, you could use step by step, or you could use pause. So you could pause it for a certain amount of seconds. And if I delete everything that we've done, if I now press the play on the action, as you can see, Photoshop is going to take a second between each of those tasks that we've used in the action. And this is something that can be very helpful in when you're explaining to new colleagues or etc. how you're actually designing some of these things without actually having to screen record your whole screen and play it back as a video, which can be quite intense for your CPU. So as you can see, Photoshop has just redone all of that action and now it works too. So like I said, one of the things that we might want to do is actually be able to change our action while it's being performed. So in this case, I don't want it to say lorem ipsum every time that I actually create this thumbnail. I want to be able to change that text perhaps midway through the action playing. So in order to be able to change any of these things, what you can do is you can use this checkbox on the left-hand side in order to say, I want to make a change when you use this task. So if I press there when we make a new text layer, and if I now press play, Photoshop will undertake all of the tasks at a second's pace. I should have probably, let me just cancel that. It looks like I'm going to have to follow the whole thing. So as you can see, it's going to go through all of those tasks that we've put in the action. And then once it reaches the make text layer action that we used, hopefully it will give me the option to edit the text. As you can see, it does. So I can now actually go ahead and say, well, this thumbnail is going to be for a Premiere Pro tutorial. I can change the text, I can press tick, and it should finish all of the remaining actions just like that. So that's a great way of being able to edit some of the actions midway. And for example, if you're editing a photo or something, then this is a great way to be able to, if you're using adjustment layers such as perhaps hue and saturation or other things that are very specific to the design that you're making. Not every photo is going to have the same exposure. It's not going to have the same colors. So you maybe want to be able to change those saturation levels every time that you run the action. You can actually tick that box and it will allow you to change any of those controls within the curves, hue saturations, perhaps filters that you apply, anything that you might need to use. And you can actually go ahead and change that while the action is being played out by Photoshop. So I'm going to quickly go back and change the playback option so it's accelerated pace again. So it should do that as quickly as it can. One other thing that you might want to do in specific scenarios is actually be able to use some of the functions that are included at the top here. So if I quickly go back and let me open up a photo, the photo that we were just using. Say, for example, one of the functions that we have in the menu here is the ability to select and select a subject. And Photoshop will automatically try and create a selection of the subject in your photo. Well, if you automatically record the action, you can't actually use any of the selection menu functions at the top right here. So if we wanted to create a new action for this, so let me just call this subject selection. It'll be in all caps, that's fine. And if I try and record, what I actually need to do is I need to go to the top here and I need to insert a menu item. So by pressing on that, you'll get this small window appearing and you can now select a menu item. So I can go to select and I can go to subject. And as you can see, the menu item select subject will automatically be applied. And now every time it should now be able to perform that function. So if I press stop recording the action, I'll move it into our thumbnail. These are all of the default actions. So Photoshop does come with a whole load of default actions. If that is something that you think will be useful for your designs. I've never really used them just because I tend to just do whatever these actions say just using the functions in Photoshop, but they are there if you think it's useful. And it's always great to have a look and see some examples of actions so that you can see how you can better implement your own actions. So all I now have to do is press play on select subject, and it's automatically going to go and perform that menu function for us. There are also some other features and things that you can change. In the actions menu at the top here, you can also save actions. So for example, if you go to the folder, you can save the action, and then you can also load actions in. So if you're changing computers or you want to be able to send an action that you've created to a colleague or someone or a client, then you can actually do that like that. You can also reset all of the actions or clear all of the actions that you've made, and that will automatically delete all of the actions that you have. And there are some other functions that you can apply here. You can actually also get rid of the buttons at the bottom, in which case, if you did have an action, which I don't, because I just deleted them all, you'd be able to press on the action directly without having to press the play, the stop button, etc. And it will automatically apply and use that action. So that's Photoshop Actions, very basically. It's a great way. I use it quite regularly for processes and designs that I have to do routinely on a regular basis. It just helps to speed up your workflow, but it also means that you don't have to save a template. You can automatically apply it with whichever Photoshop document you might be in. Moving on to the next mistake that I often make. So at the start, when I was creating templates, for example, YouTube thumbnails or other designs that I might have, a lot of the time I'd be using repeated design looks. So for example, this thumbnail always has a particular look. And I'd actually go about creating all of this every time from scratch. However, you can actually save a template in a Photoshop, and it's not commonly known because it's not clearly labeled how you can actually do it. So to save a template in Photoshop is very, very beneficial. You can automatically open the file at any time, and it will automatically prompt you to save that file as a new document. All will become clear when we save this document. So to create a template, say this was my template, and in the future, I want to be able to just start using this every time that I create a new thumbnail. Well, what I can do is I can go to File and Save As. This will load my normal Save As menu. It's just come up on my other screen. And as you can see, what I'm going to do is I'm going to save it as a Photoshop document. However, I'm going to be changing the extension of the file itself. At the moment, it is a .psd, which is a Photoshop document. However, I'm going to add the character T to the end of it. So I'm going to save it as a .psdt. If I now press save, then I'm automatically going to have to press OK to this too. It's now saved the file as a .psdt, which is a template document, template Photoshop document. One thing to bear in mind, however, is that you always need to close the document before it actually is used like a template document. So if I close this document, I'll now have to reopen it. So I can just go to my folders, select the document which I've saved and press open. What you'll now notice is that the file name for this tab is untitled1. So every time that you open up a .psdt file, Photoshop is always going to create a new document which isn't saved in any location. So the benefit of this is that you won't automatically overwrite your original template file. However, one thing to bear in mind is that you do always have to go to File and Save As, or File and Save a Copy, in order to actually save this document. If you just press Command and S, it will automatically send you to there, but it is important that you save your document because it's not automatically going to overwrite the original template file that you have. So every time that you now open up that .psdt file, you're automatically going to create a new untitled document, which you can use for your new design using the original template that you have. So you can obviously either use this on a regular basis, or you can also do all of this just by pressing play on an action. It all depends on what's your specific design case study and how you can maybe apply those things to your designs. So the last thing that I also wanted to quickly cover in this video, which is something that a mistake that I made quite regularly at the start. At the start, obviously, I wasn't as familiar with how to use masks. I did cover masks in the previous live stream, so I didn't want to talk too long about masks in this video. However, one of the things that we often do is when we have an image, perhaps a photo of a specific character, we like to use selections in order to cut out our characters. So for example, if I quickly reload this photo that we had, if I've spent hours going through select, maybe select and mask, and I've created a very complex selection, and then I've realized that I actually didn't want the selection and I press deselect, well, there's no way in to actually find the selection back unless you can still go back. However, one of the things that normally applies is that we can't undo all of those other things that we might actually have liked after deleting the selection. So one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that you can actually save selections in Photoshop and then load them up again at a later date. So in order to do this, you need to first create a selection. So I'll go select and subject, because this will get Photoshop to select my subject in this image. To save a selection, what we can do is go to select and then go to save selection. This will bring up a new window in which you can name your selection. So for example, I can save it as subject and I can press OK. So it's going to save the selection within this document and the channel you can ignore for now. But if you just make sure you name your selection so that you know which selection you want to load in the future. Now, let's say I decide not to use the selection and I made a whole load of changes to my document. And I wanted to actually, then I realized that I didn't want to get rid of all of these things, but I did want this original selection back. Well, all I had to do is go to select and I could go to load selection. And then from here, a new window will again apply and you can choose the channel or the selection that you want to reload. You can also choose to invert that selection when it loads in your document, if that's something that you'd be interested in. And you can press OK and Photoshop is automatically going to get that selection back. So one thing to be aware of about saving selections in Photoshop is that it's automatically, the selection is, I can't remember what I was going to say. The great thing about saving selections is that obviously you'll be able to go back at any point to reload that selection that you'll be able to use in the future. So yes, that's the basics of saving selections in Photoshop, and hopefully some of these practices that I've shown are things that maybe you haven't quite remembered, or things that you haven't come across yet that might helpfully benefit you in being able to speed up or make things a lot easier within Photoshop. A lot of the tricks that I've mentioned today are things that help to improve your workflow in Photoshop, and a lot of the mistakes that I have made in the past are not optimizing some of those workflows that I've used. Obviously, being able to come up with different ways and more efficient ways of designing gives you much more time in the future to actually be creative and spend more time on actually being creative in your designs rather than actually spending time repeating certain processes over and over again, or spending a lot of time on a design only to realize that you've deleted the selection, or perhaps you've changed the rasterized layer so much that you can't actually regain that original quality back, like we mentioned with smart objects. So do let me know in the comments of this video whether there are things that you've made, there are mistakes that you've made in your Photoshop journey so far, what they are, and how you perhaps overcame them. And yeah, hopefully, do also let me know how long you've been using Photoshop for. It's always great to hear how long people are into Photoshop. I know a lot of people who watch this channel are beginners, but I'm sure there are also a lot of people who have used Photoshop for a very, very long time. So it's always very interesting to hear where different people are on their journeys in Photoshop. So just after this, I am going to be live on my other channel, which is my film class. So do feel free to join me there in a minute. And I'm also going to be, well, I've got a newsletter that comes out every week. So if you are interested in figuring out in advance what next week's live stream is going to be about, then do sign up to the email newsletter and you'll be able to get all of that information, have a go at the things that we'll be covering in advance, and then hopefully you'll be able to bring your questions or the problems you faced to the live stream so that hopefully we can answer them together and go through anything that wasn't clear. So thank you for joining, everyone. It's been good to see a few of you in the live stream, and yeah, do feel free to leave a like and subscribe if you are interested in any of the future content, and I'll see you in the next live stream. So see you then.